I'm Tony Melville, Head of Corporate Affairs at Australian Industry Group, and we've got this webinar today on the ins and outs of the latest restrictions on international travel, and that is both ways, in and out, which still is pretty hard to digest. So we'll hear from travel and trade experts on the latest restrictions to international travel that were announced as part of the government's roadmap out of COVID. And things like, what are the exemptions? Is it still worth it? And can you get out of the country to do work? And there's a lot of tightness around those rules at the moment. So our guests today are Dan Engels, who's the General Manager of Visa Solutions, and Carl Schubert, who's the representative today from Singapore Airlines, and Louise McGrath has a bit on trade as well to talk about some of those issues on cargo. So I'll start with Dan Engels, and then we'll go to Carl, and Dan's going to give us a bit of an overview on what the issues are at the moment with travel. And Dan's been helping a lot of AR Group members and obviously non-AR Group members to get their exemptions to leave the country or to get staff in. So what's the latest, Dan? Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Hi, everyone. Just going to run through some quick presentation that we've put together. Let's see where we share here. And from the beginning. Okay, is it that's all good to go, Tony? All right. So we're just a bit of a recap about where we are, what we're going to cover, the reductions in the caps for arrivals, which the PM announced on the 2nd of July, the impact that it's having on travel exemptions and visas, requirements for coming in and getting out as well. What sort of visas are getting through. Then we're going to touch on the costs, and we're going to talk a little bit about the federal government facilitated flights, but not very much because we actually don't know very much about them. So first, let's talk about the caps. So just to paint a picture about where we've come from, in the 25th of March 2020, a year ago, everything was looking good. We had just under 800,000 people arriving into Australia on a monthly basis. The border closure came on the 25th of March, and then we saw a massive reduction in March, and then in April 2020 we dropped down to 5,500 arrivals. So that was the beginning of the story, if you like. If we have a look, this is the part that a lot of employers will be feeling, and it's because a lot of the labour sources have been drying up. And you can see that the number of temporary visa holders in Australia from March 2020 through to March 2021 has fallen substantially. Overall, there's about 400,000 less people than what we had previously. And you can see the really large numbers of the drop in students, 190,000 drop in student numbers, visitors, 177,000, and working holiday makers, 80,000. Now, the working holiday makers in particular impact fairly hard on the agricultural sector. So you'll find a lot of members who are in that agricultural sector. Normally the fruit harvest is usually done by the working holiday makers. Those workers are no longer around. And also the students provide a lot of the low-end work, the unskilled work around the country, and those workers are no longer around as well. If we look at the total number of temporary visa holders in Australia, it's actually dropped down by about 20%. So we've come off a high of about 1.2 million, and now it's around about 1 million. So we've lost about 200,000 people overall while we've had this the border closed. In terms of the kind of occupations that AI Group members normally would sponsor in, either on a 407 or a subclass 482 or some normal work visas, these are the most popular occupations that have been nominated over a period of time. And you can see there's some fairly large reductions over the last 12 months, from the 31st of March 2020 through to 2021. Just highlighting some of the larger ones, ICT business analysts have dropped by 64%. We've seen a 64% drop in management consultants coming through. Interestingly, for the hospitality sector, cafe and restaurant manager has dropped by 50%. Mechanical engineering technicians down by 35%. So those are the occupations that AI Group members would normally be sponsoring in. We've seen substantial reductions in those. We look at the announcement that the Prime Minister made on the 2nd of July, and he announced that the national reduction would be from 6,070 down to 3,035 arrivals per week. So a significant halving in the cap. Now, if we look at the breakdown across the states, New South Wales has been allocated more than half of this. And we'll look at this in more detail in a second because, as everyone knows, New South Wales is in lockdown and the other states, many of the other states have put up hard borders with New South Wales. So the fact that New South Wales has half of the allocation, but if you arrive into New South Wales, you're actually arriving into a hot zone and then you have problems with getting to the other states, which is going to cause some issues for employers. Victoria's got a much smaller cap, and then you get to the smaller states like WA, where you've got about 250, 260 per week, which is a very small number. Okay, this is a little bit of analysis that was put out by The Guardian. It's quite interesting. They're looking at the daily arrivals compared to the announced passenger cap. And really all this chart shows you is that the arrivals are actually generally below, at least they have been for the last 12 months, below the actual announced passenger cap. So if we project this moving forward, then I think you can safely say that the actual number of arrivals will be slightly down on the numbers that the Prime Minister has announced. So it won't be 3,000 a week, it'll be something less than that. At the moment, New South Wales has a number of border closures with the other states, and this is going to cause some issues for companies that want to try and land people into Australia, given that New South Wales has the highest portion of that allocation. And at the moment, Victoria has a red, orange, green zone arrangement, and New South Wales is considered red at the moment. So there is a border lockdown between Victoria and New South Wales. If we look at Western Australia, something similar. So Western Australia has a slightly different system in place, but New South Wales is considered a medium risk there as well, which means that there's a hard border between New South Wales and Western Australia. So many of our clients and a lot of the AI group members will be landing would have been landing their overseas workers in New South Wales and getting them onto a G2G pass into Western Australia. And now that's not going to be possible. So it's going to cause more logistic issues. And then some of these companies are going to have to work, if they need workers in Western Australia or even in South Australia, they're going to have to work within the caps for those states rather than transitioning them through from the other states. Okay, if we look at the impact on travel, exemptions and the visas, I think a lot of the members who have been involved with travel exemptions are already familiar with these rules. You've got some automatically exempt persons, Australian citizens are allowed to arrive, their immediate family members, New Zealand citizens, normally resident in Australia. These are the automatic exempt persons, fairly small categories, but all other travellers will require an exemption if they want to travel. Okay. The process for the travel exemptions.
This is travel out of Australia or into Australia, or both?
This is coming into Australia.
Coming Australia, right.
Yeah. The requirements for the travel exemptions have really improved with the department over the last 12 months. They've improved their processes. The documents that you're required to include are fairly standard. You make the application online and everything is assessed on a case-by-case basis. When AI group members come to us, we do an initial assessment to see whether or not they meet the requirements for a travel exemption. The travel exemption requirements are fairly tight, and if you do not meet the exemption requirements, then you're not going to get a travel exemption, and therefore you won't get the visa. Okay, one of the things that keeps coming up is whether or not you're in a critical skill or in a critical sector. Probably the most important part of the slide is that if you've got an occupation that you're sponsoring, which is on the priority migration skilled occupation list, then you've got a sound argument in terms of making the application for the travel exemption. Okay. The other critical sectors are your specialist medical services, air ambulance, anything that's medical related, if you like. Anything that's required to maintain the supply of essential goods and services, medical technology, mining, supply, logistics, aged care, agriculture. All of these are considered critical sectors. And so if you've got a critical skill in a critical sector, then you should be granted a travel exemption. There is a advertised priority list for processing visas from the department, and as you can see at the top of that list is your priority migration skilled occupation list, global talent employer sponsored agreements, your agricultural sector occupations. Then it comes through with occupations within a critical sector, and then it goes down the priority list from there. So anything that's in either A or B will be processed fairly quickly. And we're seeing fast turnaround times, just for everyone's information, we're seeing fast turnaround times on the travel exemptions. So if you meet the requirements, we should be able to get the travel exemption result in 24 hours. Okay. Just a quick summary of whether you're coming or whether you're going. In terms of your coming, incoming requirements, critical workers in critical sectors accounts for about 2/3 of the inbound travel exemptions approved. So we've got a chart a bit later on that shows that there's a lot of refusals for travel exemptions because it doesn't meet the requirements, and they're reserving most of their spots for the critical workers in critical sectors. If you are looking to leave Australia, if you're a temporary visa holder, you have to request a preemptive travel exemption if you want to return. So effectively, you have to ask permission to leave in order to come back because that's going to take up a quarantine spot. If you want to leave and never come back, then obviously you're entitled to leave. Anyone who's an Australian wants to travel for compelling reasons over 3 months, that accounts for about 1/3 of the travel exemptions approved, and that's under the compassionate compelling circumstances. Okay. Just a quick stats between December and June 2021. The number of travel exemption requests has increased from 19,000 up to 32,000, and the approval rate has dropped from 71% down to 43%. So the volume of people asking to travel has increased substantially, and the department's approval rate has actually fallen, which is what you'd expect. And a lot of this is wrapped up with the arguments about the number of quarantine places that are available. If we have a look at the outbound travel exemptions, about half are being approved, about 1/3 are being refused, and the remainder of this, the department wants more information. I should also let everyone know that if a travel exemption is not accepted on the first time around, if we believe that it meets the requirements, then we will strengthen the arguments, gather more information, and then resubmit to the department. Where are people going? The outbound travel exemption requests, they want to leave, they want to go to India, China, the US, UK, and Pakistan's on that list as well. Okay, at the moment, we've got 21,500 requests made every month. 1 in 6 exemption requests are approved. And as I said earlier on, most of those approvals are for people with critical skills in the critical industries. So the government's very clear about where they're providing travel exemptions. Have a look at the costs just quickly. The quarantine costs, I think most employers would be familiar with this, whether it's in New South Wales or in Western Australia. 14-day quarantine period, family of 4, 2 adults, 2 children, it's going to cost you about $5,000 to quarantine for that period in each state. So the cost of quarantine are similar. This is something, everyone, that we don't have a lot of information on, but I thought it would be worthwhile touching on because it featured fairly prominently in the Prime Minister's announcement. They said that commercial flights were coming down, but the government-facilitated flights were going up, and we presume that all of the government-facilitated flights are with Qantas. But actually, we don't have a lot of information on this at all. So Commonwealth Flights, to allow repatriation, they'll be coming through Darwin, they're going to Howard Springs. We don't know the information as to how many of these flights are available. There's currently 34,000 Australians registered with Foreign Affairs who are trying to get home, and some of these Australians have been registered since March 2020. So in order to get registered for these flights, you go to the Department of Foreign Affairs website in the country. You register and then the department gets back in touch with you and determines whether or not you meet the requirements and where you are on the priority list. And most vulnerable Australians are selected first. But as I said earlier, we don't really know a lot about the number of flights coming through and how many people are being repatriated through that process. Okay, Tony, that's an overview of what we've got so far.
No, that's really good. Carl, I might just stop there for a second before we go to you, and Graham's going to be putting up some slides. But I just remind people the Q&A box is in the bottom of your screen. Put some questions in there. And I just thought I'll just, Dan and I work closely together. We have over the last few years, and we went into the government a couple of months ago, and most people who are watching are probably going, why won't they let me leave the country? And as they explained to us, and Dan mentioned there, just this idea of the interlinkage with quarantine is their 100% driver. So if you say you're going overseas for 3 months, then you're more likely to be able to get approval because you're not going to be filling a quarantine spot a week later after a week-long overseas trip. So there'd be 12 quarantine spaces if you let people go for 1 week at a time, if I've explained the maths there well. So they're very tight on that. And they actually changed the rules very quietly so that, because what they were finding was that people were saying they were going to go away for 3 months, which seems like a fairly obvious thing to do, but then coming home in a couple of weeks. So what they did was they changed the rules so that you had to sign a statutory declaration and give evidence that you would be away for 3 months. And that halved the number of people who were going in that 3-month approval category. So it really is, we've spoken about it before as being a closed border. It's pretty well closed when you think of the many hundreds of thousands of people that were travelling every week before this event. But look, there's just a couple of questions before we go to Carl, because they're hot. So is the exemption process, this is from Sandrine, is the exemption process valid for temporary visa holders as well? Is it the same exemption process? Dan?
Yeah, Tony, the process for applying the exemption is much the same. If you're onshore and you hold a temporary visa, you do have this thing called a preemptive travel request, which is you want permission to leave. So across various industries, the way that the government is seeing, or Department of Home Affairs is seeing this, is they want to see that the critical workers have a schedule of some sort. So if you're on FIFO, they want to know what that FIFO arrangement is. If you are in, for example, the fishing industry, they want to know what the arrangements are for the foreign workers, whether they work 12 months and then they go offshore. So around that, I think and Tony, from our discussions with the department, it's fairly clear that they want to try and manage this as closely as possible so that they can fit it in with the quarantine spaces available.
That's right. Okay, so a question from Kay, what is classed as a close family member? Do they have to be an Australian citizen, or what is a close family member as well?
Yeah, a close family member is usually an immediate family member, a dependent within the immediate family group.
Okay. So what documents from Apendra, what documents do I have to provide if I'm travelling for business purposes? What sort of documents? And any restrictions on the travel destination, which is an interesting question.
We haven't come across, if you're travelling for business, in terms of the destination, as long as you have a valid reason to travel to that location, we haven't had any issues with the actual destination. You need a fairly strong business case, which means that you have to be able to explain why it can't be done online in a format like this, why you actually have to travel and have to be physically there. And normally that's with supporting letters from the company, an invitation from the overseas company, what you're going to be doing there. So it's really focused around the business case.
That's right. Yeah, you need to put up a very strong case. From Nicholas, once you have an exemption to leave granted, does it expire? Another good question.
Yeah, I think the exemptions do expire. I'll just check with the team later on and I can get back to Nicholas, but there is an expiry. And the reason there is an expiry is linked back to the quarantine places as well. Otherwise, you end up with a backlog of people who wanted to travel, let's say in March, they didn't, they're now wanting to travel in August, but the quarantine places are now fully booked for August. Therefore, yeah, it's not going. But I can get back to Nicholas and just give him the exact date that it's valid for.
Okay, last one, then we'll go to Carl. Paul is asking, Dan, can you tell me if my company can send an employee overseas for mechanical installations of our equipment? So it's an Australian company, it's going to put something into a company overseas. From your slides, I don't think we can. And then we have the issue of getting the employees back.
Yeah, you can. I mean, we have Australian employees going overseas in the oil and gas sector and a number of other sectors as well. So if they have a requirement to be over there and then to come back, then we can produce a strong business case. We should be able to get a travel exemption.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'll just go to Carl Schubert now. Thanks for that. The questions are flooding in. This is obviously a very hot topic. So Carl Schubert from Singapore Airlines, your perspective would be very interested. As one of the airlines that's kept up that connection into Australia right through, I believe, from the start. But over to you.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks, Dan. Some really good insights there into some of the rationale behind being able to leave and get back in as well. And thanks to the AI group for today's session. So I'm going to go through 5 key topics, which you'll be able to see on this next slide of ours. And the first one is with regards to the impact of obviously the travel caps on international travel. I'll then give you a bit of a take on our view with regards to the return of travel, what the in-flight experience now looks like. It's changed dramatically from, I think, what all of us have come to remember the in-flight experience as being, for those who can remember what the in-flight experience was. It's been so long. I'll touch a little bit on cargo and how that's really sustained our operations throughout the pandemic period from really sort of middle to end of March 2020. And then I'll finish on what our current schedule is. But first of all, to the impacts of the travel caps, as Dan nicely summarised in probably his earlier slides, the caps came into effect from May last year, and since then we've just seen them continue to decrease over time. And one of the biggest factors at play, which has got a tremendous amount of press since the PM's announcement on the 2nd, and even since the introduction of the caps last year, is the impact that it has on those looking to return to Australia. And ultimately, that is where the biggest impact lies. And sometimes it's not necessarily, I think, understood by the government as to how much of an impact these caps actually have. What we know for a fact is that the unilateral decision-making by the government without consultation with industry groups, key departments and airlines, is the fact that there is a significant domino effect every time the caps are reduced. We saw in May last year where, as airlines, we usually sell on a 12-month basis, 12-month lead basis. When those caps came into force, it put a significant number of passengers off our flights, and we've never really been able to clear that backlog ever since. So with every reduction and further reduction in the cap, you have this continued domino effect of more and more passengers being offloaded and disrupted in their travel. So that has been a really difficult thing to manage from an airline point of view, because what has happened over the course of the pandemic is that the government, post a national cabinet meeting, will come out and make an announcement about the caps. The Department of Infrastructure, on most of these occasions, hasn't been aware that these decisions are made. And so when we contact the department to try and ascertain what the challenges are and what impact that's going to have on our operations, the department can't give us a clear answer, because even they're not aware. So there hasn't been this forward planning or thought process as to what the impacts of the reduction of the caps will be. In saying that, our relationship with the department over the course of the last 18 months has been incredibly strong and very good, which has allowed us to really maximise the caps that we've been allocated and use those caps to the full extent, as well as receive additional caps where we need them. So some airlines have been handing back their cap allocations, and because of our relationship, we've been able to take those and then facilitate travel for a lot of Australians. But critically, what really needs to happen moving forward, and we've been saying this for some months, is a far more collaborative approach to cap management. Just to give you some insight, we operate to about 60 destinations around the world now. And of those 60 destinations, some of them multiple destinations in individual countries, those countries usually have one set of regulations with regards to arrivals. In Australia, we operate to 5 of the major ports. Each is a different jurisdiction. And that in itself is a challenge. Every time we arrive into a different city, there is a different way the cap is managed, a different way the cap is counted, different requirements of our crew. And that is a really challenging aspect. So we'd be really keen to try and see how we can try and coordinate the states together to make it a slightly easier process. So that brings us to, obviously, then the next question is, well, the easiest way to fix this is to obviously return travel. And the big question is, when is that going to happen? And a lot of the questions that we get asked and a lot of the questions that we have to answer is our view in terms of when is travel going to return. And for us, particularly over the last probably 9 to 10 months, we have come to the very sort of stark realization that it's no longer a matter of when. Trying to give people a date as to when travel is going to return is like trying to nail jelly to the wall. It's honestly impossible because it's such a fluid thing at the moment, with vaccination rates still significantly low across the majority of the globe. So for us, our thinking has turned over the last few months, particularly the last sort of 6 to 7 months, with regards to the how. And that's really is what is going to drive us forward. It's how is travel going to return? How and what are the parameters that we can put in place to provide government with a level of comfort to develop safe travel corridors? And the only way that we can establish those parameters is through the establishment of genuine conversation and collaboration between key stakeholders, the industry, government, and key departments. And ultimately, that is a dialogue that is really yet to occur in any meaningful way. And that is something that we will continue to push from our point of view to have with both state and federal governments with regards to, okay, well, what are the parameters that need to be established to set up a safe travel corridor? And this isn't necessarily saying that we want to throw the doors open and have all-encompassing travel for everybody. What we're saying is that the risk-based, staged approach to reopening Australia's borders needs to be considered very much in that manner, a step-by-step process. But what are the steps that we need to take to get there? And while the government's 4-stage plan that was announced on the 2nd of July is a start, it doesn't come with any key markers or measurables or tangible measurables that we can see that provide any indication as to how we could establish those safe corridors. And that's one thing we would like to work with government on. We know what we can provide, and ultimately we know that for the last 18 months we've been operating in a highly effective COVID-safe manner to move people and critical goods around the world. So we want to bring that knowledge and that analysis and that data that we have to the table with government and share with them to give them a level of comfort that we are capable of managing safe travel corridors, and then understanding what anxieties or concerns they may have and appease them so that we can move forward. One of the things that will support moving forward and opening those key travel corridors is digital tools and the digitisation of the verification process for things like vaccination certificates and, of course, the COVID-19 tests, which I think, pre-departure and on-arrival tests are probably going to be something that stay with us for some time until the majority of the world has herd immunity through vaccination. And so that is really something that needs to occur. So again, our work with IATA on the development of the international travel pass, the IATA's travel pass, is one thing that we've really worked hard to help develop and integrate into our system so that we have that ability to verify quickly and easily the authenticity of COVID-19 tests and, of course, vaccination certificates when they become a requirement for travel in and around the world and the globe. So hopefully, with all that knowledge and data that we have, when the government is ready to have the conversation, we're ready to sit down with them and share as much as possible. One point that we continue to make in the public domain, which sometimes gets lost amongst the noise, is the fact that we realise as an industry that we actually have a responsibility to restart travel in a safe manner. And that's because we need to instill a level of confidence in the travelling public, as well as governments, that ultimately when a travel corridor opens up, we are not increasing the risk of COVID-19 importation into these communities. So we have a responsibility to keep the communities that we're operating into safe and healthy as well. So that is a very serious focus for us, and one that we won't miss out on. So moving forward, In terms of the in-flight experience, when you do manage to get on a plane, whether you get one of the exemptions that Dan works on, or whether we are successful in opening a travel corridor, once you get on board, you're going to find that the entire travel process and experience has changed dramatically. And one of the key drivers of that change has been obviously the health and safety requirements. So we've really stepped up a significant amount of our health and safety in terms of PPE for our crew, in terms of onboard cleaning. We've really ramped up a lot of the work that we do with regards to both in-flight cleaning by our cabin crew, as well as post and pre-flight cleaning with high-grade certified chemicals, which provide a level of comfort to our customers that our cabin, when they step into it, it has been fully cleaned. And that includes electrostatic sprays. It includes colour wipes for all of the high-touch surfaces. But one of the foundations of providing people with, I guess, a level of confidence to travel is the digitisation of the travel journey. And that is one thing that has removed a lot of high-touch areas on board the aircraft. A couple of examples: we no longer have in-flight menus on board. Your in-flight menu can be viewed before you travel, as well as on board the aircraft on your own personal device. So you can see exactly what is going to be served on board. And in some cases, depending upon the sector that you're traveling and the cabin class that you're traveling in, you'll actually be able to pre-select your meal either from the a la carte menu or from our pre-flight book the cook menu as well. We've removed in-flight magazines. They are all now on your bring your own device by utilising our e-library. And that's not just for our Silvercrest magazine, that is for a range of other titles that we have contracts with, so magazines, newspapers, etc. Our Chris shop is now online as well, and you can actually purchase your duty-free, your in-flight duty-free, both before you travel, plus whilst you're on the aircraft, through the in-flight entertainment system, as well as using your own device. And the other thing that you can now utilise your own device for as well is actually controlling the in-flight entertainment system. So you no longer have to touch the screen or the controller, regardless of cabin class. You can utilise your mobile phone or your tablet to control the in-flight screen and your in-flight entertainment. So all these things reduce the need for touch. They reduce, I guess, the anxiety that customers may feel in touching those multi sort of touch surfaces. And then in addition to that, our crew have done a tremendous amount of work and upskilling in the use of PPE. We also have 98% of our cabin crew and our flight operations crew fully vaccinated with either Pfizer or Moderna, which again provides a level of comfort. And the in-flight service, which I think Singapore Airlines, and we're very proud of this, has become renowned for around the globe for many a decade, is that really personalised service. That hasn't gone. We haven't lost that. We've just had to adapt it for COVID times. And that means particularly for our in-flight meal service, where we used to have multiple settings, particularly in our business and first class cabins, those are now on a single tray. You still have the high quality food, but on single tray service. So we've taken all these measures in an attempt to provide customers with a level of confidence that their health and safety is of paramount importance when they are on board. So with all that said, passenger traffic is exceptionally minimal for us at the moment. We're still generating less than 5% of the regular revenue that we were pre-COVID from our passenger journey, and cargo has really been the key driver for us over the past 18 months. And as you'll see on this next slide, Singapore Airlines coming into Australia has been the predominant cargo carrier for Australia for the past 18 months, and for I guess for some critical things to come into the country. We were the first to deliver the Pfizer vaccine. We delivered the first Pfizer vaccine shipment to Australia in February, I beg your pardon. We've delivered around a dozen packages of Pfizer since that period of time, and over the last 18 months, we've bought in thousands of tons of COVID-19 test kits, essential pharmaceuticals, PPE, ventilators, as well as help move thousands of tons of fresh produce from Australia through both the IFAM program and on our commercial flights as well. And that's helped to support the industry, particularly fresh producers, around Australia in terms of getting their produce out to key markets around the world. One of the shots that you see there, you'll see some boxes strapped to a chair on the bottom left-hand side. That was one of our Boeing 787 aircraft that we utilised for our passenger aircraft carrying cargo-only services. The belly hold was full, around about 48 tonnes of cargo underneath that flight, and in the economy class cabin, every single chair and all of the overhead bins were filled with boxes of surgical masks. 750,000 of those were carried on the one flight, just in the one economy class cabin. So we've been doing our utmost to ensure that those key trade channels and the movement of essential goods and services can be maintained. And as Tony pointed out, we haven't stopped flying to Australia since the onset of the pandemic, and we have continued to ramp up our services. And you can see on this next slide, which I'll wrap up on, with regards to our schedule. So our current schedule at the moment is what we would call double daily, so 14 flights a week into Perth, Melbourne and Brisbane. Now, the majority of these flights are supported by the movement of cargo. As you saw from Dan's slides, the passenger caps are really non-existent, to be honest with you. So we're not deriving revenue from our passenger services. We're really supporting our flights, and not fully, with the use of cargo, but we're utilising those flights to move essential goods and to keep those key trade channels open. In South Australia, we're 4 weekly flights. That's 3 passenger flights a week and 1 cargo-only flight a week. And in Sydney, we're operating 17 flights a week at the moment. Our aim is to maintain all of those as passenger services as best we can, but we're currently working on a bit of a week-by-week basis as the government continues to move the goalposts around with regards to those caps. So we're doing our best. We're committed to Australia. We started flying here on the 1st of May 1967, and we've ramped up our operations ever since then. And we've maintained that level of commitment to Australia over the course of the pandemic. And we stand ready to continue that commitment, to continue to support Australia reconnect to the world and make sure that it doesn't miss out on those essential goods and services that need to continue moving. So with that, Tony, I'll hand back to you. Happy to take any questions now or when we hit the panel.
Okay, well, there's quite a few come in. I might just ask a couple first before I toss a question to Louise.
Sure.
Just you had there the air crew with their masks on, but what do the passengers have to wear? Because I've seen people in the plastic, just masks?
Yeah, so our all customers under the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore mandate, because we're a Singapore carrier, must wear masks for the entirety of the journey on board the aircraft. The only time they can take those masks off is when they're eating or drinking, or if they're changing their mask. So we actually give everybody who boards our aircraft a care kit that comes with a mask. It comes with hand sanitizer, and it comes with some disinfectant wipes as well. We know customers really like to have the ability to, even though we've cleaned the aircraft, wipe down their surface just to give them that extra level of comfort.
Yeah, no, that's good. I asked that because you mentioned the variations in the rules all around the place, and a friend went to Germany and he had to wear one of those full
face shields,
visor shields the whole way. And then in the country he arrived at, he had to have a test 3 days before he left, a test on the day of arrival, test 3 days after that. But then he was basically allowed to go out. Now, I know that they have different rates in the community, and obviously their level of protection is not quite the get rid of it completely as we have in Australia. But what do you think as an airline, if the government said to you, what is the best practice? What would you suggest in terms of people arriving? And do you need 2 weeks of hotel quarantine? Could you do it less? Can you home quarantine? What's your views on some of those things to get passengers moving?
That's a really good question, Tony. And I think it's one thing that is really one that needs to be answered by health. Health need to tell us where their level of comfort is and what their expectations are. Now, we've seen around the globe varying arrays of what's required. We know pre-departure testing is, particularly sort of 72 hours prior to departure, is a really good way of trying to negate those who have the virus from travelling. The question is, though, what happens between you taking your test 72 hours before departure and you then getting on the aircraft? Are you exposed to the virus at some point? Do you become infectious whilst you're on board the aircraft? All these questions are still up in the air. And I guess until health come up with a level of satisfaction and comfort, we don't really know what best practice from an Australian point of view is going to look like. And that's one of the reasons we want to sit down with government and have that conversation to say, well, what is it that you want? Because we can operationalise the majority of things, but if you ask us to do something, or if you put in place parameters that aren't operationally viable, it's not going to support the return of travel. And that's what we need to work together on. I come back to unilateral decision making, with the caps. We've seen the impact that has, whether it's intended or not. The point is that there are probably ways around supporting the health outcomes that Australian governments want, that doesn't require you to make these changes to the caps. Now, I'm not a health expert, but when you look around the world, there are other measures. And, had we been able to sit down with government 6 or 7 months ago to have the conversations, maybe even put in place a trial for vaccinated passengers, we may well have been in a position now to hypothetically operate vaccinated flights and non-vaccinated flights. To allow those coming in to isolate at home, because we've done the tests, we have the data, we know what is viable and what isn't. And therefore, you wouldn't necessarily have to have reduced the cap so significantly, if at all. So it comes back to that ability to have the conversation, to understand and to plan, and we haven't yet got there.
Okay. So the flights that you showed there coming in empty, and Dan talked about the 32,000 Australians that still aren't able to come home. So why, apart from the restrictions on numbers, why haven't they been able to come home? Is it cost barriers, or is it more than that?
No, it's really availability. It comes down to availability. And again, there is whether it's a lack of understanding or just a lack of comprehension as to what is happening on the ground. But people don't necessarily have an ability to drop everything and travel within 24 hours notice. You need to plan, particularly if you have had a life. I mean, let's just take the UK, for example, where the predominance of Australians are and have been for some time in terms of wanting to come home. If you've been living in the UK, you've got a lease, you've probably got a credit card, you might have a number of things that you need to get rid of in terms of beds and sofas and whatever else. You can't get a call from DFAT on Monday to say, be at Heathrow Airport on Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. to get your flight home. It doesn't work like that. And unfortunately, that is how some of the surplus caps for the vulnerable have been handed out, which is why we're seeing, not all of that surge capacity taken up. So people need to be able to plan. And then when you do plan, and hypothetically, if you book a flight 3-4 months in advance, and then a month out, the government says, well, guess what? We've just cut caps again by 50%. Well, us as airlines need to determine who gets to stay on that flight and who has to come off. And that's a very, very difficult process. It's a really challenging process. But that's one of the reasons, why there's been such an inhibitor for people to come home, is because of the fact that the goalposts have continued to change. You've had this domino effect of people being offloaded and disrupted, building up in the back end. And there's been no increase in the caps when the caps have come back on. We went from 100% capacity in May last year to going down to kind of, 50 people per flight. That was then cut, a week later or 4 days later in Melbourne to 0. And we've never really ramped up to a point where you can clear that backlog entirely.
Okay, I might just toss a question to Louise McGrath, who looks after our international, and she's done a few trade trips over the years, I know. And one of the questions that's come in is that a legitimate? Are there any trade trips going at the moment? Can you get out of the country by using that reason? And also just about that cargo, how's that going? You're getting a lot of issues from members trying to get material into the country. What are the issues around that, Louise?
Yes, that's right, Tony. So as Carl said, companies like Singapore Airlines have done a great job in making the best of a really quite awkward situation and putting freight on passenger seats and the like. But we can't ignore the fact that 90% of our air freight came into Australia under passengers' feet. So once all those passengers left, then obviously there were no planes. So the government did step in, I think it was April last year, with something called IFAM, which is the International Freight Adjustment Mechanism, and that's now been extended until September this year. It's not really a like for like. It's really just to help with those critical exports of seafood and, high-end agriculture. So particularly, I think many on the call who perhaps are exporting parts and the like, it's not really an answer for them. And which means that's put a lot of pressure on sea freight, which separately has increased. So the average price for a 40-foot container, sort of April 2019 was around $1,200, and now that's $5,000 to $6,000. So that's 40-foot containers still only can pack the same amount that you could pack 2 years ago. It's not as if you can suddenly, fill it with more high-value goods. So if you're sending the same goods, your freight costs have gone through the roof. So one thing we've been successful at is working with state governments to help companies to adjust their business model to this new reality. So a good example is an exporter of fresh goat's milk in Victoria. She used to export daily to Japan. That was no longer reliable, so she's converted it to dried milk powder. So still goat's milk, but in a different form. So in South Australia, that government has got a grants program to help companies work with consultants to find a different way, so whether it's changing their packaging, doing perhaps 3D printing in the destination market, all sorts of solutions. And in Victoria, we've been successful in getting some funding for a full-time consultant working at AR Group to work with companies to adjust their business model. Because we don't think, this isn't going away for a while. And as Carl said, even if, I'm sure if passengers were suddenly allowed to, come in and out of Australia freely, it's going to take a long time for air freight to recover. So we need to adjust.
Okay. Just on the question of travel, a good question came in on the vaccination passport that often gets talked about. You've been dealing with the Global Business Coalition that we're representative of, as well as a chief of that at the moment. What's the talk there? Are we really going to get vaccination passports like the old, I guess, the digital version?
The yellow ones, yeah. my old yellow fever booklet. Well, I have my Medicare vaccination passport, but DFAT acknowledges that won't be accepted around the world. It doesn't have the level of security that a passport does. And I assume, similar to passports and visas, it's airlines who are taking that risk. So we really need to make sure airlines trust the documentation. The EU have a system that I understand, doesn't meet the security requirements of many others in the world. And I understand that organised crime have already started looking at ways that can manipulate these documents. So it will take a long time. IATA will need to be involved. So I don't think it'll be quick.
No. Is anything on that, Carl? Have you been involved in any of those sort of discussions?
Yeah, so the IATA Travel Pass actually utilises that blockchain technology, which protects it and makes sure that the authenticity of those certifications is valid. One of the biggest challenges is going to be for governments around the globe to buy into that and put in place systems that have an ability to talk to that app. So whether that's through API technology or whatever it might be. We know the Australian government has just gone out to tender for the digitisation or the digital sort of side of things for validity of vaccine passports. But, one of the biggest challenges is going to be in terms of the testing. We know testing is going to probably be required for the next few years, both pre-departure and on-arrival testing. So the question is, how do governments maintain or set up these testing facilities that then allow for the results of those to be sent to the individual who can then have them digitally certified? I noticed a question on the Q&A was, why is the impost on the individual? What happens if I don't have a smartphone? These are questions that governments around the world are going to have to consider as they move forward with digital technologies. Yes, a hard copy certification may be viable, but the question is, how do you ensure its authenticity? And that is something that is going to have to be done at a global scale. This is a global pandemic that is not going to be solved by siloed individual jurisdiction responses. It needs to be a global solution.
Okay, another couple of questions for you, Carl. Actually, there's the question about how many passengers are allowed on each flight out of Australia. Are there limits on that?
No limits on the number out of Australia. It's only on inbound coming in. So we can carry as many as who wish to go and get approved to leave. We'll take them.
Fantastic. Okay, a question from Brad. I'll just jump to it. It's a great presentation, Carl. So thanks from Brad. So he's got a European resident family. and with he's booked on Singapore, he's booked on Singapore Airlines, of course, to return to Australia in December. And you were talking about the short notice that people get, but when are they likely, he asked, to find out if they can actually come? Will it really be his latest departure at the airport?
Look, no, it wouldn't be that late. Absolutely not. We wouldn't let it get to being that late, particularly if they're booked now. So there was another question on the Q&A that asked how long these caps are going to be in place for. And there's this kind of soft thinking that it'll be August 31st. That's what the government's indicated, but there's no formal suggestion that that's when those caps are going to lift. So as airlines, we're really in the dark at the present point in time as to when the caps are going to go back up or when there's going to be an alternate solution that sits outside the caps for vaccinated travellers to come in. So, Brad, to your family, look, fingers crossed that there aren't any further changes and we can obviously get them on board and bring them home. But in terms of the decision making that goes into who stays and who goes, it's not as binary as a lot of people might think. There are so many factors at play. The first port of call for us is last booked, first out is usually the way we look at that. But then we have to consider against that, is that last booked a high value frequent flyer? Is the last booked a family of 4 and we only need 2 seats because we're 2 seats over? So therefore they don't go, but we'll need to look at someone else. Is the last person booked someone who has previously been disrupted and just put on that flight? We don't want to disrupt them again. Finally, is that person who's last in, are they categorized as vulnerable under DFAT? And so therefore, we really shouldn't be, offloading them. So there are so many different factors at play. And this is why when we get, notification on the 2nd of July that 12 days later we have half our caps coming in, our teams haven't really slept for the last sort of 7 or 8 days.
Okay. There's a question, Carl, about vaccines, types of vaccines. Does Singapore Airlines have a preference for a Moderna or a Pfizer or AstraZeneca or?
No, we've been really clear, contrary to some others in the industry, that look, ultimately the acceptance of vaccines is up to individual governments. Prior to the pandemic, what we saw was individual governments would set the requirements for an individual to enter their country, whether that was, vaccine requirements, whether it was visa requirements, etc. And that's really something that individual governments are going to need to set the parameters for. And I think what we'll find is as more and more vaccines roll out around the world, we'll find individual governments will set a standard for what they believe to be, the requirements for individuals to enter their country with vaccinations. Now, I think at the present point in time, and I stand to be corrected on this, but I think most countries are accepting any vaccination that has been approved by the World Health Organization.
Okay, that makes sense. So a question from Dean is, and this one might be for Dan, but jump in, Carl, if you know the answer. Is there an opportunity to seek quarantine exemption for international travels in any circumstances, or for quarantine to be completed in a private facility? I guess just for movie stars.
Yeah, look, there is. I might leave it to Dan to answer that one, but we know of a few and they haven't gone overly well, I think, but I'll leave that to Dan to take.
No, Dan?
Carl, the only one that we're familiar with is the South Australian trial for vaccinated persons who are going through 7 days at home. Apart from that, we haven't been made aware of any others. What do you know, Carl?
Oh, the movie stars things that are coming.
There's been a few, there's been a few high-end, very, the 1%ers, so to speak, who can pay for their own security, who will pay for AFP to come and check on them, those sorts of things. But they're such a small percentage, wouldn't even be under 1% of those coming in. So, and ultimately exemptions, we know, just they don't necessarily exist.
Okay. So question, as an HR professional, would I be allowed to leave the country to lead an office closure overseas? So that's obviously an important business reason, but in that HR category. Dan.
Tony, I don't think that's going to make the requirements, to be honest. I think the department would see that as something you might be able to do online. You would need to have a fairly strong business case as to why you need to be there physically.
Okay.
If we were giving the advice on that, we would suggest that probably doesn't meet the requirements.
Okay. And we don't know. I mean, it might be 1,000 people or something. It might be something huge. So in which case, maybe that advice would change. So maybe if you want to contact us on that one with all the details, we might be able to have another look at that. Is a strong business case, asks Trish, tied to company annual revenue? No, it's more about the reasons, isn't it, for travel than the money?
It is more about the reasons, but obviously the larger the entity, the different divisions, they've got different lines of business. So so the larger companies are always going to, in my view, have a stronger argument than your small businesses.
Okay. A question from Nicole. Hi, Nicole. We know Nicole. Is an exemption still required if you're travelling for work to New Zealand when the bubble is open? What's been happening with New Zealand travel, Dan?
When the bubble is open with New Zealand, then you are able to travel between Australia and New Zealand, and that we saw that in the figures for the arrivals in May. So in May, with the travel bubble, there was 54,000 arrivals between Australia and New Zealand. But I'm not sure of the latest one, but I think the New Zealand bubble has now closed with the outbreak in New South Wales, or at least it's been curbed. So that's been brought down. But normally with the travel bubble in New Zealand, it did allow free travel.
Okay. And a question from Christina. Hi there. I have my employer looking at travelling from Australia to either Europe or the US for specific aircraft training for aircraft maintenance for a period of 3 weeks, aircraft maintenance engineer, Australian citizen. Will this be something the government would be likely to approve? I know it's hard without seeing the whole case. Dan?
Yeah, on the face of it, Tony, I would say that was something that probably would meet the travel exemption requirements. So we would take a closer look at that, but that one would probably get across the line.
Okay, and I think that might be it. Look, I might just go, if there's any there I've missed, we'll try and get back to you. But I might just check down the end of the line here, see if anything's come in. And any final comment or anything from Louise or Carl? Louise?
So, Tony, I noticed that someone talked about inbound air freight, and that is a problem. But the government was obviously bringing in some flights, but prioritising medical equipment and materials, such as vaccines and the like. So yes, it is a problem, but there were some allowances for imported freight as well.
Okay, there are a couple of late questions came in actually, Dan. You might know the answer to this one from Kate. Question for Dan: can you pass on the cost of quarantine to the incoming worker, who I assume is on a 482 visa? Or does it have to be paid for by the employer as per visa costs?
There is no requirement that we're aware of, which is like I imagine that the question relates back to the Skilling Australia Fund levy, which cannot be passed on, and some other costs. We're not aware of any cost restrictions on who can pay the cost of the quarantine. For most of the industries that we do, for example, the oil and gas industry, the employer covers all the costs, including the quarantine.
Okay, and two very quick ones for you, Carl. I've been looking at my frequent flyer points as well, but Sheila asks about, what happens to your frequent flyer points?
Yeah, so our loyalty department have continued to monitor the situation, and we've continued to sort of place some rolling extensions onto those points. But yeah, one thing I would say is we've done a huge amount of work, and look, I didn't cover it in this presentation because there's just not enough time, and there's so much that we have been doing. But trying to provide what we call non-air opportunities, so things through Chris Shop and Chris Plus for people to actually utilise their points and I guess put some value to those at the present point in time. But we do know that a lot of people have frequent flyer points because they like to use them when they're flying. So our loyalty department will continue to look at that. And I think at the present point in time, most points have been extended through at least until the end of this year. And we'll just continue to monitor that as it goes.
Okay, and this is very last question because we're a minute over. It's from Kaishan, who's got a colleague in Surabaya in Indonesia, and there's some suggestion they could go to Singapore, wait there, and then come to Australia. Is that something worthwhile doing? Is that something?
No. Yeah, no. So that's not a viable option as far as I'm aware. Singapore actually has quite strict border measures in place as well. So they would need to meet the criteria for entering Singapore in the first instance. If they were to get that approved and then come, they would still need to do 14 days quarantine here in Australia when they arrived anyway. So. Okay.
Look, that's been fantastic. Thanks for that. I'll wrap it up there. So thanks. To any further questions, you can email us at onlineevents@aigroup.com.au, and there will be a copy of today's presentation available to everyone who's registered within the next 3 business days. Thanks again to Dan, Carl and Louise, and that's all for now. See you next time.